Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this very timely and appropriate webinar entitled The Russian Invasion of Ukraine, Military and Strategic Dimensions. My name is Colonel Rick Turner. I am a visiting U.S. Army War College Fellow here at the Saltzman Institute. We would like to thank our co-sponsors for today's panel, the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, the Harriman Institute of Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European Studies, the International Security Policy Concentration, ISP, at the School of International and Public Affairs, the Columbia SIPA Veterans Association, and lastly, but not least, the Columbia Center for Veterans Transition and Integration. Much has been said over the last several days and weeks about the situation that continues to unfold in Eastern Europe. I personally have attended a dozen or so panels and discussions on the general topic over the last 2 weeks. Of the ones that I have seen personally, none of them have focused specifically on the military and strategic dimensions that our panelists will explore today. And we are very, very fortunate to have three of the Saltzman Institute's very own and renowned experts in this field. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you the panel today, consisting of Professor Stephen Biddle, Professor of International and Public Affairs and Director of the International Security Program at the School of International and Public Affairs, Professor Paige Fortna, the Harold Brown Professor of U.S. Foreign and Security Policies in the Department of Political Science, and Professor Richard Betts, the Leo A. Shifrin Professor of War and Peace Studies and Professor of International and Public Affairs. We will not be able to post their bios in the chat, but you can view their full bios on the Saltzman webpage. I'll just read a little short thing about each of them. First, Professor Biddle. As I said, he's a professor of international and public affairs at Columbia. He's also an adjunct senior fellow for defense policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Professor Biddle has served on the Department of Defense Policy Board, on General Petraeus's Joint Strategic Assessment Team in Baghdad, and as senior advisor to the Central Command Assessment Team in Washington, D.C. back in 2008. He was also a member of General Stanley McChrystal's initial strategic assessment team in Kabul in 2009, and on a variety of other government advisory panels and analytical teams. Professor Biddle lectures frequently and regularly at the Army's War College and other military schools, and has presented testimony on congressional testimony on issues relating to Iraq, Afghanistan, European arms control, and conventional net assessment. Professor Fortna, the Harold Brown Professor of U.S. Foreign and Security Policy in the Political Science Department. Her research focuses on terrorism, the durability of peace in the aftermath of both civil and interstate wars, as well as war termination, which will be appropriate for today's discussion. She's the author of 2 books, and has published numerous scholarly articles in journals such as International Organization, World Politics, International Studies Quarterly, and International Studies Review. Professor Fortna holds a Bachelor of Arts from Wesleyan University and a PhD in Political Science from Harvard. And lastly, but certainly not least, Professor Richard K. Betts. He is the Leo A. Shifrin Professor of War and Peace Studies in the Political Science Department and a Professor of International and Public Affairs. Professor Betts was the director of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies for 23 years and director of National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations for 4 years, where he is now an adjunct senior fellow. Previously, he was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and an adjunct lecturer at the Johns Hopkins University's Mead School of Advanced International Studies. He's also served at different times on the Harvard University faculty as a lecturer and visiting professor. He received his Bachelor of Arts, Master of Arts, and PhD in Government from Harvard University. And like I say, we are extremely privileged to have these three here to discuss this topic today. We look forward to hearing from all three of our distinguished panelists. And I will now turn it over to our panel for opening remarks, which will be followed by a quick Q&A session with the audience. If you would like to ask a question, which I'm sure there will be many, please post them in the Q&A section, and I will read your question to the panel following their remarks. And with that, let's begin with Professor Biddle, if you will, sir.
Yeah, well, thanks, Rick. My assignment is to talk about the war at the tactical and operational levels. I'm sure Colonel Turner will have a lot to say about that as well, but by way of starting the conversation, Russian performance at the tactical and operational levels in Ukraine presents an interesting puzzle. They have huge material advantages over the Ukrainian defenders, and yet Russian performance has been remarkably poor to date. They still haven't taken what the Defense Department estimates to have been their first 2 days' military objectives. Their casualty rate so far is estimated by DoD to be in the neighborhood of 5,000 to 6,000 fatalities, which is already more than twice the entire US fatality count in the 20-year-long US war in Afghanistan. And if this war continues on at the intensity that it's been fought to date, 4 more weeks of this will incur more Russian fatalities in Ukraine than the Soviet Union suffered in 9 years of warfare in Afghanistan. Given all this, most experts, I think, have been surprised by how they've done this badly. And by all accounts, Vladimir Putin is quite surprised at why they've done this badly. So why is that? And is it going to stay that way? Or will it improve as the Russians adapt? And I think that the short answer to the question, and I'll elaborate on this a bit, is that materiel isn't the only thing that matters, right? Weapon technology and numerical superiority aren't the only things that count in military outcomes in this kind of conflict. And the Russians have systematic problems in supporting capabilities, in human performance, and in force size relative to the area of the country they're trying to conquer that aren't going to fix themselves anytime soon. They will get better. The Russian tactical performance on the ground has already improved relative to the utterly shambolic practice of the first couple of days of the war. But I don't think they're going to get enough better to enable the Russians to win the war defined in the proper Clausewitzian sense of securing the political interests for which they started the war in the first place at a cost that's commensurate to what those interests are worth to them. I think the best they can hope for, and Paige, I'm sure we'll return to this later, is some kind of compromise off-ramp that will leave them with a result that isn't as catastrophic as it could be, but is going to be way short of what they went into the war to obtain. And they could end up with a lot less than that. And the result could be a lot worse than that for everyone, actually, including us as a property of some of the escalatory dynamics that others will discuss later. But my assignment is to talk about things below the level of grand strategy and war termination. So let me take the balance of my time and say a little bit about those. And in particular, I want to, as time permitting, to touch on a couple of key contributors to the outcome as we've seen it to date. Strategic integration failures on the Russian side, logistics, communications, and other difficulties in the sinews of war on the Russian side, some force to space ratio and troop requirement constraints they're stuck with, problems with air operations, problems with modernization, problems with combat motivation and Ukrainian strengths. And I may or may not get through all that. But let's start with issues of strategic integration. It's very important in war that your tactics be suitable for your operational plans, which are supposed to be suitable for your theater strategy, which is supposed to make sense for your grand strategy. So it's widely believed now that the plan that Putin took into the war called for a quick fait accompli, in which they would topple the Zelensky government in Ukraine in a day or two, install a puppet government, and leave the rest to the puppet government to manage and get out. If that was what they had in mind, very rapid march to the capital, collapse House of Cards kind of opposition, and install a political regime they liked before sanctions could bite, before the West could be unified, before Ukraine could mobilize reserves, before all these things happened, then it made sense for them to sacrifice some degree of security in the interests of speed. Now, what we saw in the opening days was an extreme version of this, right? I mean, Russian armored formations moving in column, on roads, in the open, no dismounted infantry support, no suppressive artillery support, no integrated forward air defense, no pause for tactical reconnaissance, no cover and concealment. And the result of that was catastrophic losses. Now, if you really have to move fast, you might decide that you're willing to take those kinds of risks. But a decision that you're going to build an entire campaign plan or against a requirement to move that fast that requires those kinds of tactics in the presence of an enemy who isn't just a house of cards results in catastrophic loss rates that you can't continue because combat motivation won't permit it, right? About the second or third time that a battalion tactical group gets decimated operating that way, the next one being asked to do this decides that maybe this isn't such a good idea and they hang back, and the performance of the entire force declines, which is pretty much what we've seen. So I think some of these decisions they've clearly unmade now, right? They no longer think they're going to take the capital in 2 days, so they're not driving down roads in column anymore. But their tactical performance still isn't particularly strong. And part of that has to do with integration at the grand strategic level. Given the structure and the nature of the Russian state, the nature of the regime and its economy, it's not clear that they've been able to build a mass military, not just a small modernized fraction of the force, but a mass military with the skills you need and the low-level initiative and tactical judgment you need to operate proficiently at the tactical level without suffering debilitating casualties. And they're not going to change the structure of the Russian state, right, in the next few weeks. So what about the sinews of war, logistics and communications and so on, right? There's a common phrase in this business that amateurs talk strategy and professionals talk logistics. So let's talk a little bit of logistics. Modern war consumes supplies at a ferocious rate. Right, the U.S. Army's 7th Corps in Operation Desert Storm in 1991 went through 9,000 tons of ammunition and 2.4 million gallons of fuel every day. To keep all that stuff flowing is required if you're going to operate a mechanized military and modern high-intensity warfare in a way that can sustain a high tempo of operations. Russia, however, has historically underinvested in logistical capabilities. They have systematically preferred tail over tooth, and especially so in recent years. In armies with corruption problems, and Russia was the 44th most corrupt state in the world in 2021, according to Transparency International, logistics systems are often a primary target because they're so easy to raid for skimmable resources. And the result of that has been massive problems in the Russian campaign so far with vehicle maintenance, spare parts availability, the quality of munitions and supplies, trucks with dead batteries, wheeled armored vehicles with flat tires because the inferior rubber dry rotted in storage, rations with expiration dates from the last century, contaminated fuel stocks. And the result of all this has been major offensive actions that have been halted for days, just sitting still, for simple lack of fuel and ammunition. Well, this is probably going to be about as far as I'm going to get before Colonel Turner pulls the plug on me in the interest of time. But let's wrap with some force to space ratio troop density issues, because these contribute to a lot of the logistical problems that I was talking about a minute ago. The Russians were widely reported to have massed something on the order of about 200,000 troops around Ukraine for this offensive. And that may sound like a lot, but in fact, it isn't. Ukraine is a huge place. To control all of this territory is a big project in which 200,000 troops can look small pretty fast. So let's compare this with some relevant historical benchmarks. Let's look to World War II, for instance. This part of the world was very heavily fought over in the Eastern Front theater of World War II. In the Battle of Kursk in 1943, or in the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive in 1944, the Russians massed 2 million troops on a frontage comparable to that on which they're operating now with 200,000. If you don't like World War II, let's fast forward to 2003, right, in the US invasion of Iraq. The US invaded Iraq in 2003 with a troop count roughly the same as the one the Russians are using in Ukraine, but on a frontage less than 1/10 of that the Russians are trying to mount an offensive on in Ukraine. The Russian army, given this radically low density of troops for the radically large area of operations they've chosen for themselves, simply doesn't have enough soldiers to defend their flanks or maintain a perimeter. They're now operating on a 2,500 kilometer frontage. Right? If you distribute 200,000 troops uniformly over that frontage, you get fewer than one soldier every 15 yards. And it's worse than that because you can't distribute forces uniformly over a frontage like that and accomplish anything. You have to concentrate at key points. The result is that there are large stretches of Russian flanks where there's just nobody, where there's no meaningful perimeter and flank defense. And that in turn means massive vulnerability for all this intensive logistical traffic that's supposed to be advancing behind that flank perimeter to keep the troops at the front supplied. And all that's even without any serious attempt to actually take any of the cities that they're advancing on yet. Urban warfare eats armies. Urban topography demands enormous troop counts because of the nature of the terrain and the nature of the canalized fighting that takes place in them. Again, let's just use some benchmarks here, right? Let's look at the Second Battle of Fallujah in 2004, for instance. The US in 2004 committed 13,000 troops to take a city, Fallujah, with a population of 275,000 and an area of 25 square kilometers. Kyiv alone has 2.8 million people and an area of 840 square kilometers just to take Kyiv, right, at a US normal troop density, even if you're not going to do anything else anywhere in the theater, would require 400,000 troops, or more than twice everything that Russia has in this entire theater. And that says nothing about Kharkiv or Odessa or Dnipro, or you get the idea, right? So there are lots of other difficulties in the Russian campaign that we can talk about in Q&A, right? The performance of the Russian Air Force has been a puzzle lots of people have been wondering about. The ability of a much ballyhooed Russian modernization program to deliver has been much criticized. And it needs to be said that Ukrainian performance has been remarkably impressive. And war is a two-sided enterprise, right? Russia's failures would mean nothing if Ukraine had been as poorly disposed as the Russians. They have not been. All this rolls together, I think, produces a situation in which I think Russia is stuck, right? They're going to have to change the way they operate somehow. They're not going to be able to just keep going with Plan A. They'll get a little bit better, but I don't think they're going to be able to secure their original objectives in the way they originally planned. I think what they will probably be forced to do is to besiege major cities rather than even attempting to take them, and starve out the defenders rather than overrunning the defenses. That is a slow, ugly process. Right? The siege of Leningrad in World War II took over 2 years and killed by starvation over 600,000 civilians. Right? More than the atom bombing of Hiroshima. If the Russians resort to tactics like that in Ukraine, which their tactical performance may require of them if they're not simply going to accept a compromise settlement, this war could get a lot uglier than it is before it ends. And with that, why don't I hand the floor to my colleagues.
Wow, thank you very much, Professor. Professor Fortna, I think you want to go next, huh?
No, I think, isn't Dick Betts going next?
Oh, my apologies. Professor
Okay.
Betts.
The factors that Steve was talking about are ultimately going to determine the odds of the larger outcomes of all of this. And it's obvious, but important to remember that we're still in the early phases of what could be a prolonged war of attrition. Therefore, I'd just start with two general points. One, perhaps obvious, but that simply compounds the tragedy, is the extent to which this appears to be a complete lose-lose situation in which it's hard to see any result that doesn't leave both sides, as well as third parties in the rest of the world, worse off than before. And second, with apologies to the audience, I don't have any confidence in predicting the outcome because I think there are still plausible paths to any of fairly radically different results, although the probabilities do differ. It seems to me there are, in rough terms, 4 alternative outcomes. Russian victory, Ukrainian victory, a compromise settlement, or prolonged instability without a settlement, something like Afghanistan that faced the Soviets from 1980 to 89. Best possible result, also the least likely, that's a Ukrainian victory. And of course, how you define victory in either case can be varied and nuanced, but I would count a Ukrainian victory as more or less reestablishment of the status quo ante, Russian withdrawal, but not including retreat from Crimea and Donbass. Seems to me this probably would depend on a revolution or a coup d'etat in Moscow. And I'm no expert on Russian politics, but that seems unlikely. The worst possible outcomes, probably the medium probability, and that's Russian victory, however you define it. I'd say a gradual attrition and neutralization of Ukraine's regular military capability, installation of a pro-Moscow government in Kyiv, withdrawal of Russian forces contingent on neutralization and demilitarization of Ukraine. And in the face of the rude disappointments that the Russians have faced militarily in regard to quick success that they haven't gotten, are they more likely to back off or to double down? It seems to me the latter is the tendency so far. And while an economist might not see that as the best approach, I imagine a psychologist probably would see it as more likely, though this can also lead to a compromise of one form or another as well. But to move decisively, ultimately in this direction would require for the Russians a lot more mobilization, attrition, and brutality. But it could become more likely if there's a faltering of Western economic pressure, as the indignation and solidarity of the West might fray, as the sympathy for refugees might turn as their numbers become overwhelming. I just think a fair amount of uncertainty in that regard. But we're now conducting an experiment to test the effects of international economic interdependence on conflict. To which side does it give an edge in coercion? Now, the West certainly has the advantage in the imbalance of the impact of sanctions. They hurt Russia more than they hurt the West. But Russia may have the advantage in that it's likely willing to suffer more than the West may be. As the Russians tighten their belts, deepen the alliance with China, wait out Western indignation, while the West perhaps tires of the expense and inconvenience of replacing energy, other disruptions attendant to the sanctions. The most likely outcomes, it seems to me, is either of the other two possibilities between the best and the worst: compromise settlement or some sort of inconclusive guerrilla war while the Russians and their local clients control the urban areas. There's speculation of different forms such compromise might take. One, of course, might be a rough division of the country along the lines of the Dnieper River, turning Ukraine for some time, at least, into something like East and West Germany or North and South Korea during the Cold War. And in this case, Moscow would entertain negotiations for neutralization and institution of a submissive but reunited Ukraine as the quid pro quo. This would probably involve long diplomatic back and forth, perhaps over many years. It would also probably coincide with a NATO military buildup, beefed up tripwire forces in the Baltic states, Poland, maybe tensions emerging around Kaliningrad, various sorts of measures in reaction, which of course face Putin with exactly the sort of threat that he said he wanted to prevent. The second intermediate alternative would be a pro-Russian Ukrainian government in the cities and some degree of something like guerrilla warfare in other parts of the country. Will the Russians tolerate it insofar as they have a choice, or crush it with brutal force? Can they depopulate or neutralize the relevant parts of the countryside? What are the similarities and differences to how they handled the problem in Chechnya? These are questions I think we'll see more analysis of as more information becomes available. But of course, Ukraine isn't exactly Afghanistan, and it's far more important to Moscow than Afghanistan was before they withdrew at the end of the Cold War, and far more important to them than Afghanistan was to Americans by 2021. So the question of how permissive the conditions are for a thriving insurgency in Ukraine is an important one, which Steve may want to get into since his most recent book touches on important related general questions, but issues of the suitability of terrain, ingress routes for supplies, and so on. I won't say a lot about the danger of escalation, although I think that has gone from negligible to low. And when it comes to escalation in a conflict like this between the great powers, even low odds are alarming. The proposal for a no-fly zone, I think, is utterly mistaken. I have a short article explaining why in the online Foreign Affairs if people are interested in the specifics. Other commentators have expounded on that. But how else might escalation occur? Well, even without a provocation like a NATO declaration of a no-fly zone, the Russians will have an incentive if they're facing insurgency of one form or degree or another. They will have an incentive to maximize the interdiction of supplies to the insurgents. And that makes me wonder whether we can be assured that the present generation in Moscow understands and accepts the precedents of outside support for insurgencies. For example, in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan during the Cold War, the precedents that essentially made the intervening great powers in local conflicts accept without direct retaliation against the sources outside supplies to the insurgency. Another possibility would be escalation from cyber conflict, which might for some time be limited to one form or another of tit-for-tat exchanges, but which could generate irresistible temptations or opportunities to score substantial effects, which could then escalate to effects involving physical destruction or severe impacts on society, like interference with electrical supplies and so on. And that would then increase the possibility of temptations for a lurch beyond the cyber realm to kinetic retaliation. with those sorts of general and perhaps unsatisfactory speculations, I'll turn it over to Paige.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Fortna, the floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Rick, and thanks, Steve and Dick, for your comments. I wanted to start today with two quick caveats. One, I'm not an expert on Ukraine or Eastern Europe. My expertise is in international relations theory, particularly as it pertains for this panel to war termination. So that's what I'll talk about today. And I find the webinar format always a bit disconcerting because not being able to see the room, I don't know who I'm talking to. And so I apologize if I am saying things to, for example, international relations scholars who already know what I'm going to say. But I thought I would talk about two concepts in international relations that I think help explain the mess that we're in and why it's particularly hard to get out of it. And those are the security dilemma and concepts coming out of bargaining theories of war. And I'll just say a quick word about security dilemmas. But before I do, I have to acknowledge our late colleague, Bob Jervis, who did so much to explain the dynamics of security dilemma escalation to the world and whose wisdom we sorely miss during this crisis. So the idea of a security dilemma is that two enemies can easily get into a spiral of escalation and war because things that each side does in order to try to defend itself threaten the other side. The other side reacts trying to defend itself. That in turn threatens the first side, and you get that kind of spiral. And so I don't buy into the kind of strong version of the West is to blame for this war that John Mearsheimer and others have argued, but it is true that Russia has felt threatened by NATO expansion and by the idea of a Western-friendly Ukraine on its borders. And of course, Russians' reactions to that then have threatened now existentially Ukraine and less existentially the West. And now the actions of NATO and the West to defend itself against further encroachment, including sanctions, feed into Russian fears that the West desires its demise. And so that's the kind of risk of a spiral. I think that's part of the spiral that got us into this war, and this is the risk of escalation. And I agree with Dick that I think the probability of very severe escalation is low, but it is terrible if it happens. This is a spiral that could, in theory, end in nuclear war. So I think that it's important to keep that in mind as the West and the US thinks about reactions, to try to think about to what extent we can make any reaction that we take obviously defensive rather than offensive. And sometimes that distinction cannot be made, and that is when things are risky. So the idea of trying to doing everything we can to contain this threat without provoking worse escalation, and that is hard to do. The security dilemma is called a dilemma for a reason. It's hard to get out of. But I think that concept is probably fairly familiar to people. So I wanted to say a little bit about the idea of bargaining theory of war and what it tells us both about how we got into this war, or how this war began, and why it's difficult to get out of. So war is extremely, extremely costly. We are seeing that right now. It costs people's lives. It costs money to wage for both sides. It costs the destruction of cities. It's costing dearly to Russia's economy and, of course, to the Ukrainian economy. It's extremely costly. And because of those costs, there exist settlements, in theory, that would make both sides better off than continuing to pay those costs. So the answer to the question, wouldn't it be better if we all just got along, is yes. But that doesn't mean that we can all just get along. Because the fact that there are these settlements does not mean that they can be reached. And the bargaining theory of war focuses on two main reasons for that, sometimes often operating in combination: information problems and commitment problems. Sometimes also there's an issue of indivisibility of stakes that tends to be less relevant, and I think can usually be gotten around. So what are information problems? What is the problem here? So if both sides knew ahead of time with certainty how costly the war would be to themselves and to the other side, and how much each side cared about the stakes, then they could figure out a bargain that they would both prefer to paying those costs of war. But it's hard, sometimes impossible, to know those things ahead of time. And so, as others have said today, it's clear that Putin miscalculated pretty severely in deciding to invade Ukraine. I think Ukraine maybe also miscalculated somewhat to the extent that it thought Putin would not launch an all-out war to take the whole country. So why did Putin miscalculate? So I think there's something to the argument that Kim Martin and others have made that part of this is a result of Putin's isolation, particularly during COVID, apparently, where he just wasn't getting a lot of information. He was probably surrounded by yes men who were telling him what he wanted to hear about the state of the Russian military, et cetera. But even without that, I think that some of what needed to be known to prevent this was not knowable ahead of time. So the extent to which the Russian military would perform poorly, maybe that was knowable by Russia. The extent to which the Ukrainian military would fight as well as it has, the kind of unity that Ukrainians have shown in response to this in a country that has not been particularly unified, particularly on the question of orientation towards the West as opposed to Russia, the very swift and unified reaction of the West in terms of sanctions, in terms of sending material, et cetera, that has surprised even the Ukrainians and even the West. So there's not really any way that Russia could have known that. So I think those information problems and miscalculation help explain why the war started. And so what solves that information problem? Well, the fighting itself solves that information problem. Putin now knows a whole lot more than he did 2 weeks ago. If he had known 2 weeks ago what he knows now, I think it's quite likely that he would not have invaded, at least maybe not more than kind of recognizing separatist regions and maybe not even that. But now that he knows it, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And there are two reasons for that, and they're the same ones: information problems still and commitment problems. So the information problems persist, and this kind of follows up on just what Dick Betts was saying, that there's a lot of uncertainty still about how this will play out. And so if you think about the need to create a settlement that makes both sides better off, you have to know what the cost will be to both sides going forward. And we don't know yet. The Ukrainians don't know, the Russians don't know. How much will Ukraine be able to sustain punishing attacks on its cities and its civilians? If and when cities fall and Russia occupies part or all of Ukraine, how much of a resistance will an insurgency be able to mount? With what cost to Russia? With what cost to Ukraine? Likely very high. Russia's track record in Chechnya and elsewhere suggests that it has little to no compunction about civilian casualties and trying to pound people into submission. But does that pound people into submission, or does that stiffen their resolve even further? Is there a tipping point between those things? Where is that? I don't think that's knowable. How long will Western unity last? Dick mentioned this as well. There's been this amazing popular outpouring of support, but people will turn to other issues to some extent. Gas prices will bite. Will that support waver, or will it hold over time, and for how long and how much? How much is the economic pain, how much economic pain and isolation is Russia willing to bear for Ukraine exactly? Will there be strong pressure from oligarchs, from the Russian military, from domestic dissidents to withdraw, or will Putin be able to maintain control? Will Russians rally behind him? Will they buy his narrative that see these sanctions prove that the West is out to get us? People who know more about Russian domestic politics will have much more informed takes on this. From what I understand, it's not likely that the military will step in to do anything, but what happens on the part of oligarchs and possibly what happens on the sort of civilian protest side is a little bit harder to predict. So unfortunately, nothing reveals any of that information in a way that would make a settlement possible other than time and fighting and actually paying those brutal costs of war. So I fear that Ukraine and Russia are in for a long, grinding war of attrition that starts to reveal that information. And I think it's theoretically conceivable that Putin, realizing the miscalculation that he has made, could decide to cut his losses. It's not really his personal MO, but even setting that aside, in theory, he could decide to pull out. He could say, see, I told you this was just a special military operation, quite limited. I'm declaring victory and leaving. I've proved that I was willing to step in to support the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine and show NATO that I was serious about standing up to NATO expansion, and just try to sell that at home. And here it actually helps that he has quite strong control of the information and narrative at home. Could protect him on his domestic flank, but probably not enough. So we know that dictators who lose wars, especially if they lose them badly, and especially ones that they started, don't tend to last long. And unlike in democracies, they don't just get voted out and get to retire, they tend to get hanged. So Putin has really strong incentives here to double down, to gamble for resurrection, to hope that he can, create less of a mess out of this mess by continuing to invest in it. And unfortunately, the longer he continues with greater losses to Russia, the harder it becomes for him to survive politically, pulling out without concessions. So what sort of arrangement could give Putin enough of a face-saving exit that would not threaten his political survival and his life, frankly, that would be better for him than paying the ongoing cost of war, and better for Ukraine than paying the ongoing cost of war, with the uncertainty around those that I mentioned before. So even if all that uncertainty got cleared up, here's when we run into commitment problems. So what could a settlement look like? What are some ways to divvy up the stakes being fought over, the pie, as it were? So what does the pie consist of in this conflict? Territorial control of Ukraine and the orientation of Ukraine, or whatever is left of it, whatever sort of rump state of Ukraine is left if something gets partitioned off, toward the West in terms of its defense, trade, political system, etc. Now that the war is underway, there's also room for negotiation over the lifting of sanctions, for example. And of course, this is also part of a larger political struggle over the orientation of other countries in the former Soviet sphere. So thinking about just the Ukrainian territorial piece, in theory, you could divide Ukraine up like a pie, or more realistically, Ukrainians and Russians could divide Ukraine up like a pie. They could calculate their relative cost to each side and divide accordingly. So maybe that would, if Russia is doing particularly poorly, maybe that's giving Russia control of the separatist regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, either recognizing their independence or allowing them to join Russia, or all of Ukraine east of the Dnieper River, if over time the sort of consensus is that Russia will do better and Ukraine will fare worse. So that provides another focal point. In theory, the line could be drawn anywhere, but of course there are serious implications of this for the people who are living wherever the line gets drawn. And you could come up with some sort of arrangement for how much whatever is left of Ukraine was oriented toward and in the sphere of the West, from not at all to some sort of neutrality to full membership in NATO and the EU. But how do you make those kinds of divisions and settlements credible? How does each side convince the other side that they would abide by that agreement over time? So if Russia occupies part of Ukraine, what reassurance does Ukraine and the West have that it won't push further later on, this time with better preparation? How could Ukraine commit the people who are relegated to live in those territories under Russian control not to engage in an insurgency? So that's just on the territorial part of it. The commitment problems on the issue of Ukraine's orientation, I think, are even harder now that it has been invaded. How could Ukraine conceivably commit not to run into the arms of NATO? And why would NATO, how could NATO credibly agree never to have it? The sanctions part, I think, is easier to negotiate over. Sanctions can be pulled back pretty quickly, although it is hard now to imagine Europe deciding that Nord Stream 2 is still a terrific idea, that being even more energy dependent on Russia than it has been is wise. So it's hard to imagine Russia sort of getting back all that it had before. So all those commitment problems on top of the information problems mean that it's really hard, even knowing now what Putin knows about how this has gone, it's still really hard to think about a way out, an exit ramp, as some people call it. Now, before I end, I want to say that none of this means that war will last forever. As the title of Fred Igley's classic book on war termination puts it, every war must end. It will end eventually. I think it's possible to see a temporary ceasefire. So far, it's been impossible even to get humanitarian, very limited geographically, temporary ceasefires for humanitarian purposes to hold. But it's possible that as the war grinds on, it'd be possible to get a temporary ceasefire to give people some respite. Maybe eventually we see kind of a sort of frozen conflict, as we've seen in other parts of the former Soviet Union, with part of Ukraine occupied, and some sort of mutual deterrence that prevents the rest of Ukraine from joining NATO for fear of further encroachment from Russia. And meanwhile, Russia is deterred from further encroachment by knowing that that would get the cost of war going again, and also push NATO, Ukraine into NATO. But I think that's a long way off. Thinking down the road, there are institutional arrangements that could make some sort of ceasefire, or if a negotiated settlement is hammered out, as I said, down the road, quite a way, there are institutional arrangements that can make that ceasefire more stable, mechanisms to monitor ceasefire lines, create demilitarized zones, dispute resolution procedures to keep things from flaring up from very low level skirmishes. But unfortunately, one of the main tools that has been used to help belligerents maintain peace over time, international peacekeeping, is not off the table in this case, but it's particularly hard to achieve when one of the parties has a veto on the Security Council, as is the case now. So that doesn't make it impossible, but it makes it much less likely empirically. It's not happened in the past. So unfortunately, I do not see a quick resolution. I think this is going, as others have said, I think this is going to be a long and ugly war. I think it gets worse before it gets better for everyone involved. I really, really, really hope that I'm wrong. I've never more hoped that I was wrong. I will, just to end on a slight note of optimism, I will, or sort of a caution against too much pessimism, I will say that one thing that comes out of studying peace processes and the mediation processes that go into trying to reach peace is that it often looks like it is completely hopeless up until the moment that it is not completely hopeless anymore. So I hope that we reach that point sooner rather than later. And I'll end there.
Wow, thank you, professors, very, very much. I mean, I know the rest of the group, as I did, got a lot out of that. We've got a few questions that are popped up, and I'll start reading them. But if I could, professors, if I could start off with a question of my own, and then we'll go into the audience questions. And I think I'll go in the area of deterrence. And a few of you mentioned it today, actually. I mean, Putin and Russia have effectively deterred the West, NATO, from taking any boots on the ground or more overt actions than we have already taken. Are there any lessons, or as policy experts and people who instruct future policy experts, are there any lessons we might be able to look at how Putin has executed this event that may lend some a window into where we may be able to more effectively execute deterrence against him? I'll pause there.
Well, this involves a lot of questions that take us back to earlier parts of the whole problem, and debates about who provoked or deterred whom. I mean, one classic problem is making a clear differentiation in the eyes of actual participants between deterrence and provocation. And what to scholars sitting detached in an ivory tower sometimes seems obvious or simply a premise of the exercise, in practice is often completely muddled. And indeed, the fact that in both the Russian and Chinese languages over time, there have been big differences, at least in the past, in how the English term deterrence was translated relates to this. This is a long-winded way of saying deterrence is not always as straightforward as scholars like us tend to think. NATO was expanded, I would argue, not on grounds of deterring Russia, but for other reasons, but indeed was seen as a provocation by the Russians. And at this point, the deterrence really exists on both sides, a deterrence to escalation. And NATO, I think, still wields as much deterrence in that regard as the Russians do. The question of either escalating to direct combat between NATO and Russia, or beyond that to inadvertent or even a purposeful use of nuclear weapons. So I don't think the essential lessons of Russian ability to deter NATO so far point to any really very new perspectives on what the nature of the problem is. But I think should remind us that we sometimes overlook the degree to which the concept of deterrence is often misinterpreted and has perverse effects when it's not regarded by both parties in the same way.
Thank you, Professor. Okay, I think our next question, first from the audience, is from Steve Marati. And Steve, I apologize if I did not pronounce your name wrong, but I'll read your question. Steve is a ISP class of 2020. His question is as follows. The theory tells us that in modern warfare, speed tends to come in the cost or with the cost of heavy losses, as the lethality of modern weapons necessitates using cover, concealment, and suppression of fire to survive and move forward, all of which takes time to do effectively. How did Russia's prioritization of speed to decapacitate the government in Kiev contribute to its initial tactical failures there? Professor Biddle, that is probably a question directed to you, sir.
Okay. Yeah, the premise of the campaign was that they were going to get a quick regime change to preclude all sorts of counteractions from NATO and the international community. And if you really are going to insist on taking Kiev in the second day of the war, then you're stuck operating in ways that expose you to losses, because the standard means that modern militaries use to reduce their casualties are all time consuming. The Earth's surface is a complex military environment that offers plenty of cover and concealment that can reduce your vulnerability to enemy fires. But to take advantage of it, you have to move off the roads and move cross country. That slows your movement down dramatically. You have to dismount infantry to act as the eyes and the ears of buttoned up armored vehicle crews. When you reduce the speed of the offensive to cross-country movement by walking infantry soldiers, you're radically reducing your rate of advance. You have to scout forward to identify the most concealed, most covered approach route. That kind of reconnaissance takes time where nothing's moving at all. There are all sorts of things that modern militaries have done ever since 1917 to reduce casualties, but they all cost time. Now, you can make a reasonable choice as a campaign designer to sacrifice some of that security in order to increase speed. The Russians went to an extreme on this in the first couple of days of the war, to the point where the speed wasn't worth anything. They very rapidly impaled themselves in Ukrainian defenses that they couldn't penetrate. Right. So there are some choices on this trade-off that are just manifestly inappropriate, and that was the way the Russians went early on. But some of it is defensible in intent, in that they felt that they had to go fast and were willing to accept higher casualties in order to do that. I don't think they were willing to accept the casualties that they've in fact suffered. I think that was the result of simply bad choices rather than an understandable choice on a trade-off spectrum.
Thank you, Professor. And we'll go on to the next question here. This next question, I think it's from Michael Martell. The pre-24 February stage was characterized by notable Western releases of intelligence to preempt Russian plans. What impact do you see that having on Russian coordination on and after 24 February? And how may that have influenced tactical execution?
I'll jump in then. My sense is that it didn't affect Russian behavior very much. What it did was to affect Western behavior. It significantly facilitated the Biden administration and Zelensky's efforts to unify a Western coalition that would impose aggressive sanctions and that would provide rapid, massive arms transfers to Ukraine by defusing a variety of information warfare strategies that the Russians had planned to adopt that was designed to drive wedges between the members of this political coalition. By outing all that before it happened, that made it effectively impossible for the Russians to do things like, false flag attempts to suggest that the Ukrainians had started the war. There's a similar effort going on now with respect to chemical and biological weapons, where the United States government believes that the Russians may try and release such agents themselves and then blame Ukraine for it. And so they're publicizing this possibility in advance to prevent primarily any wedge from being driven politically between the members of the coalition as a result. That effect has been substantial, I would argue. There's very little evidence that it changed Russian planning very much. I think the Russians were capable of screwing up their own plan themselves. The idea of taking Kiev in 2 days and installing a puppet government was pretty ambitious, to put it mildly. And I think even a reasonable degree of caution, even if you didn't think you knew a lot about Ukrainian military capabilities, I think a reasonable degree of caution would have suggested that taking these kinds of risks on that timetable had a really serious chance of going wrong, which of course it did. My guess is that our information operations weren't responsible for those bad choices. My guess is Putin was responsible for those bad choices.
I would jump in and add to that. Sorry, I remuted myself there. I think the other thing that it helped with on the Western side is that because the early part of the war unfolded pretty much exactly as the US intelligence had shown, it meant that there wasn't a lot of scrambling to figure out what was going on, and that time and attention could be put towards a response. So I think that is speculation on my part, but I think the rapidity of the response and the unity of the response, as Steve said, was aided by that intelligence.
Oh, thank you very much. We have a question here from Professor Peter Clement. In looking at past wars, if Zelensky has to leave to survive, what is the track record of governments in exile, quote unquote?
Not great. Hi, Peter. I mean, I think there's a reason Zelensky has stayed put. I think a lot of that has to do with morale. I mean, he's really been an amazing and again, surprising a lot of people, unifying Ukraine behind him. There may come a point where he has to decide whether he, leaves or dies. So far, he seems to be willing to stay and risk his own life. I think it's more likely that at some point, if he is killed or captured and there's a successor to him, and Russia is occupying Kyiv, that there might be some sort of government in exile, then the West is sort of recognizing a government that isn't in power, and we've seen that happen before. It doesn't. I think that would play out in the scenario of a kind of long, protracted instability of a Russian-controlled, government in Ukraine and an insurgency fighting.
I've never looked into this, but I can't recall a case of a government in exile being notably involved in diplomatic or political maneuvering that seemed to matter in the evolution of international relations. I may be wrong, but I remember during the Cold War, the governments in exile of the Baltic states, I believe, still technically had embassies in Washington. And I remember hearing of doddering 90-year-old ambassadors who had been in exile for 20 plus years attending embassy receptions. But it's hard to think of exceptions.
There are examples of leaders of rebel organizations that have been in exile and have been involved in negotiations. Parts of the ANC were in exile. A lot of the PLO leadership was in exile. So there is a precedent for leadership, but not on the interstate side of an exile, a leadership in exile involved in negotiations. How applicable that is to this case, it depends how much of this turns into a long protracted civil war, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the dynamic here is likely to be different than certainly the cases that come immediately to mind for me. I mean, there's the Civil War cases that Paige mentioned, then there are the World War II governments in exile after the Germans overran much of Europe. The scenario that's logical here, I think, is if the Russians successfully invest Kiev and then besiege it, there's a significant chance that eventually Zelensky is killed and that the city becomes uninhabitable and eventually hundreds of thousands of people starve to death. And in those kinds of scenarios, there would be a more viable entity outside Kiev that could conceivably negotiate. The problem in all of these scenarios is the third element of kind of Clausewitz's trinity, the people, right? By all accounts, the level of popular fury at Russia right now among Ukrainian civilians can't be discounted in any of the war termination thinking we do. It's implausible to believe that any Ukrainian government for the foreseeable future could politically survive a meaningful compromise with the Russians right now. Now, years from now, after a 2-year-long siege of Leningrad and Kiev, who knows, all bets are off. But for the foreseeable future, right, the next couple of years, if Zelensky is killed and a successor tries to negotiate, the successor will not be able to guarantee peace in the country. The successor will not be able to guarantee a stable Russian puppet in any part of what is now Ukraine, because there will be an insurgency, and that insurgency will undermine the ability of a puppet government to rule. So, I mean, if Zelensky dies, if Kiev simply is obliterated, if there's going to be some sort of negotiated off-ramp that can get enough buy-in from enough members of the Ukrainian population that it doesn't simply inaugurate the insurgency to follow, that there would have to be some kind of viable government in exile that is made viable by the West in an effort to terminate the war. I don't know what that would look like. I don't know of any historical analogs to it offhand.
And I think it's particularly hard for whatever government in exile to maintain any sort of legitimacy with people who are there suffering the cost of war. I mean, this dynamic we've seen play out in civil wars, where the leadership that is in exile is, seen as the guys in suits who aren't paying the cost of war. They're selling out. So that's a dynamic that does not
absolutely.
It's not conducive to a settlement.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. The next question, I think, comes from Marcos Lopez. And again, I apologize if I mispronounce your name. But his question is referring to Professor Betts' mention of a coup d'etat in Russia. What do the panelists believe would be the odds of it, assuming a possible blame game will begin in Russia in the near future, as soon as thousands of coffins return from Ukraine? Who would pay the price? Are there any generals willing to pay the price for Putin's miscalculation? And he ends his question there.
Well, I'll start with some thoughts, but then I'll defer to my colleagues. I mean, there are generals paying the price right now. A remarkable feature of this war to date is that if the Ukrainian general staff is to be believed, there have been at least 3 2-star generals or higher who've been killed in this war on the Russian side already, not to mention a half dozen or more colonels and officers below that. This is not a counterinsurgency environment where the senior officers can safely be ensconced in large forward operating bases in the rear. They are taking significant casualties. Now, my sense of my Russia studies colleagues who know much more about Putin than I will ever know is that, like Kim Martin, they tend to think that that he's rational enough that eventually he'll seek an off-ramp. That said, right, again, if we want to go back to Clausewitz, the heart of the Clausewitzian argument about the dynamics of escalation is that any given stage in a war like this, decision makers face a choice between accepting defeat, failure, and sacrifice of the stake, or mobilizing to higher levels of violence to double down and continue to seek the stake. And that drives an escalatory spiral that statespeople have to work hard to restrain. So far, Putin has not been working hard to restrain it. His instinct systematically in this conflict to date has been, don't seek an off-ramp and back down, double down and escalate. And that incentive will remain. From the standpoint of Putin's personal self-interest, I suspect, as someone who doesn't make any claim to know Putin or his history or psychology, throughout the process, all the way into nuclear escalation, because standing down in a compromise settlement, classically in an autocracy, runs the risk of costing the autocrat his life, as Paige pointed out earlier. And if you're going to die, whether you take hundreds of millions of others with you, might affect lots of people, but doesn't appear to particularly affect Vladimir Putin. So if that's the case, and the man is establishing a pattern of double down, double down, double down, double down in an environment where doubling down eventually leads to nuclear war, if you can't prevail on the ground in Ukraine, which I don't think he can, because prevailing means either preventing or defeating an insurgency as well as defeating the Ukrainian regular army, and I don't think he has the troop count to do that, sooner or later, the officer corps, who will be looking at this not with respect to Vladimir Putin, who cares if 200 other millions go down with me if I die, they'll have a different interest calculus on this, and I think eventually will be strongly motivated to take matters in their own hands, rather than let Vladimir Putin take Russia and much of the world down with him into a nuclear holocaust. Now, that's not to say that this is going to happen anytime soon, or that the prospect of the ruble losing half of its value is going to cause a coup d'etat. But if you walk the war termination logic that Paige was sketching further down that road than Paige was willing to take it yet, in all fairness, and you just ask the David Petraeus question, right? Tell me how this ends. Well, if Putin's incentives is to double down, where it ends is in nuclear war. And I think there are a lot of people in Moscow who would prefer to get rid of Vladimir Putin rather than to allow that scenario to play itself out. At least I hope there are.
Thank you, sir. We have a question here from ISP 2021 graduate, James McLaughlin. His question is as follows. Regarding sieges of major urban areas, would the massive resources required to achieve success in these operations leave the remaining Russian forces operating in the other parts of Ukraine lacking the support necessary to defeat Ukrainian irregulars or local counterattacks? If so, does it create an impossible choice for Russian commanders? Interesting.
Yeah, I think the short answer to a very astute question is yes. Professor Betts asked earlier what I thought the prognosis for insurgency in Ukraine is, whether the conditions are permissive. I think the conditions are very permissive in Ukraine, not for the reasons that people have historically imagined, right? You need to be in a jungle or in a mountainous area to wage an insurgency. That's not true anymore. Right, Iraq was neither a jungle nor a mountain range, and yet there was an extremely viable insurgency there for a long time. Insurgencies are increasingly urban. There are large urban areas in Ukraine. The basic problem, however, is that, as James was just pointing out in his question, Putin simply doesn't have the troops to do in Ukraine what he did in Chechnya. Right, if you were to apply US doctrinal norms for the number of counterinsurgents you need per members of the population that you're trying to stabilize and apply this to Ukraine, you would need 900,000 counterinsurgents to stabilize a country the size of Ukraine. In Chechnya, Putin used troop densities higher than US doctrine in order to crush the Chechen insurgency by force of brutality. He simply doesn't have the people to do this in the size of the country of Ukraine. It's just not an option for him unless he went to a general mobilization whose political consequences are unforeseeable. And part of the reason why I think Putin has driven himself into a cul-de-sac that he cannot readily get out of here. He is going to lose this war in the Clausewitzian sense. Right? He's bitten off way more than he can chew, given the effect he has had on Ukrainian opposition to his plan. Right. So the question is, what will the modalities of defeat look like? Will there be some sort of compromise off ramp at relatively low levels of catastrophe, suffering, and destruction, or will it be all the way to nuclear war? Because, as James points out, even if he manages to invest Kiev, the troop, he would take half of his current troop strength in theater just to surround Kiev at normal doctrinal densities, just to surround it, right? Not to take it. If you want to surround it, lay siege to it, and starve people to death, which may be very well where he's heading, what that means is the rest of the country is going to be radically undefended in normal counterinsurgent doctrinal density terms. And the costs to this in casualties for the Russians, while they're trying to starve Ukrainians out of Kiev in the way the Germans starved Soviets out of Leningrad in World War II, these costs just mount and mount and mount. Right? I don't think there's any plausibly, attractively viable brutality option for Putin in Ukraine, just given the size of the task he's carved out for himself and the availability of resources at his disposal. I think this was a classic act of overextension, over-optimism, and gratuitous strategic error that doesn't leave him with a viable way out short of some sort of embarrassing stand down or worse.
Oh, thank you, Professor. We'll take another question here from the audience from Elise Giuliano. And Elise, I apologize if I mispronounced your name, but the question is, would Russia perceive US supplied drones to be NATO involvement in the war? Do warring sides generally agree on which types of weapons external to states are allowed to supply?
Well, I would commend to the questioner's attention a foreign affairs essay published today by some bozo named Biddle that deals with that issue in substantially greater detail. The very short version of that somewhat longer essay is that weapon provision itself rarely leads to war against the weapon provider historically. If you provide base camp areas that, for example, insurgents use to attack you or to attack others, there's a substantial track record of the victims lashing out and counter-invading to destroy that haven area. Provision of weapons alone much less commonly ends in retaliatory warfare. The issue with providing aircraft weapons, I'll escalate the aircraft option beyond drones, right? Drones, I think, can safely be provided for all sorts of reasons. They're small enough you can fit them in a tractor trailer, right? The Russians' ability to detect that there's been a sudden massive increase in what is already a sizable Ukrainian inventory of drones because of transfers is of limited. I'm not sure how well their intelligence would be able to do that. The interesting question of the last few days is, what if Poland provides MiG-29s to the Ukrainian Air Force? And the problem there is, unlike a Bayraktar drone, a MiG-29 is large enough that it's not easy to put it in a truck and covertly introduce it into Ukraine. It would have to fly across the border from a NATO base in a place like Poland or Germany. And that would look to the Russians, understandably, like an attack, like a haven, not weapon transfer, but an attack. The movement of active combatants from NATO territory, active combatants, right? Piloted airplanes, armed and fueled across the border. And the Biden administration has concluded that that is dangerously escalatory and is closer to a terrorist haven of the kind that the states do have a substantial track record of attacking to prevent. I think drones would be in a different category. They would be closer to the kind of shoulder-fired anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons that have been flowing across the border like Niagara Falls for the last several weeks.
I would just jump in and say I'm not comfortable answering any question from Elise on what Russia will perceive, because she knows much more about Russia than I do. So I'd like to know what you think, Elise, but I know we don't have a webinar set up where you can tell us. So maybe later.
My apologies. I was having a mute issue here. Next question is from Amalia Fromelt. The question is as follows: the nuclear threat we are facing is considerably more significant given its crossroads with hybrid and cyber warfare. What are the implications of this? Could it catalyze another massive nuclear proliferation of state actors? Or contrarily, could it result in a reinvigoration of disarmament efforts and the erection of norms such as an ABM shield treaty of sorts?
That's a great question.
I think it's unlikely there's going to be some discernible change or impact of this sort unless something like or close to or credibly threatening the actual detonation of a nuclear weapon occurs, because otherwise the issues, the incentives, and so on have been long in place, long debated. And until something actually happens that raises the specter of detonation for the first time in 72 years, it's not clear what the effect will be. But that also highlights the question of whether the risk of detonation of nuclear weapons is as tiny as we've all become accustomed to assuming out of the habit of 72 years of non-use. And there the concern that's most often brought up in recent times, and that relates to the debate over nuclear proliferation as well, is the danger of accidental technically flawed procedures inducing a detonation that is not fully intended. That's probably less likely in interactions between the United States and the Russians than it is in some other potential nuclear dyads in the world, but it can't be written off. And the one thing that relates to this question too is the hypothetical possibility that in extremis and with a leader that might be become as unbalanced as some of the popular commentary on Putin suggests he could, although I think that is exaggerated too, the risk that the Russian idea of escalating to de-escalate could be implemented. Now, in one sense, the idea that this is some new Russian doctrine has been exaggerated because a lot of people noticing it in the last decade are too young to remember that this was essentially NATO doctrine that was well established and not a new idea. But that's the one situation in which hypothetically you might see a deliberate decision for a demonstrative or symbolic use of, say, a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon, a single one or a handful of ones. Even that's pretty hard to see, even from an extraordinarily excitable Putin. But as the cliche goes, stranger things have happened.
I would add, I'm trying to remember who wrote, there was an op-ed in the New York Times, maybe, I don't know if it was earlier this week or the end of last week, talking about the particular danger right now that the arms control regime has been, it's not moribund, but it's been sort of neglected. Treaties have expired and there hasn't been much done to re-up them. So a hope out of this crisis is that it puts a little more energy behind that process again, which I think is, it's just not been on the top of anybody's radar screen for a long time. I don't know if I think that that's likely or not, but I think it's possible, and that would be a hopeful outcome out of this.
Well, that's a hope, but I think there's at least a strong argument that the effect of the crisis will be the reverse. And that is to loosen restraints on trying to compensate, get an edge, catch up, refurbish, and so on to increase nuclear capabilities as opposed to reducing them.
And it certainly is not a conducive atmosphere right now for negotiations between the United States and Russia over anything. So in the short term, it's not hopeful.
Okay, we've got about 9 minutes left, so I think we have one more question, and it's from Michael Reed. What short-term lessons do you think leaders from around the world, both dictators and democratically elected, what do you think those leaders are drawing from the Ukraine-Russia conflict?
Well, I don't know. It probably varies a lot, and a lot of them probably don't yet know what to make of it, waiting for the dust to settle. But I wouldn't be surprised if, in one form or another, people everywhere are recognizing that what had crept up on us is a new Cold War, and that in very stark contrast to the dominant mood and assumptions in the West about the post-Cold War world, picking sides is going to be something that statesmen have to think about in ways that they really haven't in the past 30 plus years. And that means as well navigating the evolving relationship between Moscow and Beijing, which seems somewhat up in the air at the moment, but will be a critical ingredient in this new Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, I think states will draw a variety of lessons downstream, but one lesson they've already drawn in shockingly large numbers is that not all states in the international system are benign security seekers, and you need to balance aggressively against threats. I mean, the idea that Germany, right, would be supplying 1,000 anti-tank missiles and 500 shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles to Ukraine right now is just head spinning to me. For my entire professional career, right, Germany has been a brake on most of these kinds of aggressive U.S. proposals for balancing behavior vis-a-vis once upon a time the Soviet Union, more recently Russia and China, and in the blink of an eye, they've spun 180 degrees, and NATO has gone along with them with remarkably little dissensus. I think what that suggests is a shockingly widespread and shockingly rapid, if you want to call it a lesson, if you want to call it a change in perception motivated by a startling event, call it that. But in terms of kind of epical shifts in the way the politics of the Western Alliance have worked, I think it's impossible to view this as anything other than a response to shock at what just happened in Ukraine. That's an immediate lesson that has big consequences and has solidified in minds with remarkable speed. Now, maybe it'll unsolidify over time as this thing descends into stalemate and as costs grow and as dissensus returns. Lessons can always be unlearned after they're learned, if we want to use the lesson language here. But I think that's a huge lesson, and boy, did it happen fast.
I agree with all that, and I would also add that I think the extent of Putin's miscalculation and the importance of the views of people whose territory you think you might want to control, and the way in which the world has reacted to that, I think also, and whether that lesson, what that lesson will be will depend on how this plays out over time. I completely agree that it's sort of too soon to know, but I think that I think others are watching that.
Well, thank you very much, professors. Any any final comments before we close out here? We've got a couple of minutes left if you'd like to make any closing comments.
I just thank my fellow panelists and thank everyone for showing up on a Friday afternoon. And I know there's a lot of events going on Ukraine, and just thank people for showing up.
I agree. I would just leave with the thought that emotions are running high now, and probably on the other side as well. And it will be useful but difficult as time goes on to try to sort out the complexities and nuances of how we got from here to there, or from where we were to where we'll wind up. Because my own view is the answers are going to be not simple, and not the ones that play politically with great strength. The answers are going to be where the blame for what's happened is not all on one side. And we're sorting that out without being considered a traitor or a wimp or whatever is going to be a delicate political enterprise. And as a citizen, I just hope we'll be able to do that productively and without counterproductive effects.
I would just add, on the assumption that a majority of those on the call are either current SIPA students or recent SIPA graduates, this war is why you were in graduate school, right? This is exactly the kind of problem for which you either are now seeking education or recently received education. And I would urge you, as you think about this war, as you obviously are by your willingness to sit through 90 minutes of sage conversation about Ukraine, right, that you bring systematically to bear on your thought what you were taught at SIPA, right? This is why the curriculum is what it is to help you think your way through these problems and reach more sensible responses to it. When I was in Washington, there was a certain tendency for Washington to be full of people who were in graduate school, didn't like it, got to Washington and said, "Whew, man, I don't have to do any more of that academic stuff anymore. Right now I can just do policy." And that was then a mistake, and that is a mistake now. If you've been listening carefully to the last 90 minutes, you've seen 3 academics at Columbia and a fellow at Columbia systematically applying concepts and ideas and theories and principles from the coursework we have been teaching you to this problem. You may or may not agree with us that it has any purchase on these issues, right? I believe it does. I hope if there's been any value to this conversation, that has been what it has been. But I would urge you, as you leave this session and continue to engage on these issues, at risk of sounding silly, pull out your lecture notes, right? Go back to the power. But this is why we present all of these things. Don't lose the opportunity of taking full value out of the education that you are receiving or have just received to try and add value to the debates over these issues, right? This is, we've argued out since time immemorial that there are life and death stakes in international security policy issues. There are potentially hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people in Ukraine, Europe, and elsewhere whose lives are going to depend on the outcome of this conflict. This conflict is what the curriculum is about, among other kinds of conflicts. Use it, take advantage of it, and go try and help with it.
Wow. Well, to the panel, on behalf of everyone listening, let me just say thank you, professors, for offering your incredible insights, your scholarship, and your time on this Friday afternoon. I think all of us are leaving here today with a deeper understanding of the incredible complexities of this immensely challenging time. And so thank you very much. And I think with that, we will close out. Thank you again for joining us today.